Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series presented by the Education Committee for the Southern California PGA. The Catalyst webinar series is a bi-weekly educational platform for creating success and change in your club and career. We're very excited to kick off 2024 with Craig Kessler, Director of Public Affairs and Chair of the CAG Legislative Committee. Craig has made a sort of tradition out of presenting on the Catalyst webinar at the beginning of January. He's been our first presenter of the year several times over, and it's kind of been come to be known as kind of the Craig Kessler State of the Union. Talk a little bit about golf legislation, water, regulatory and public policy challenges. Craig's got the inside track on all of it. Good morning, Craig. Thank you very much for being here this morning. Also want to thank Kevin Fitzgerald, Assistant Director of Public Affairs, for also being on to assist in this morning's webcast. Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series.
Good morning, John, and thank you for inviting me back again yet another year. Obviously, I got renewed. That's always a good sign.
Definitely. So true to form, go ahead and take us through your presentation. And for all the PGA members on this morning's webcast, we want to make it as interactive as possible. So Craig combs over something that you want a little more color on. Feel free to raise your hand. Don't need to wait to the end to list your questions. We want to make it as interactive as possible. And Craig is willing and ready to speak extemporaneously on any subject or question that you have. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, and I think Kevin might be handling those questions because it's hard for me to do two or three things at the same time. In looking at the title, and I think, boy, that's pretty ambitious, what to expect in 2024. But let me give you a little bit of a preview. I think, Kevin Fitzgerald and I often get asked, what do we do? And the answer, the shorthand answer, the elevator speech, if you will, that we've come up with is that we work every day in all the places where golf and public policy intersect. That's an awful lot of places. I mean, some of them are obvious, like the state legislature or city councils or halls of administration, but it goes down to planning commissions, water providers, park commissions, golf commissions. I mean, if you looked at our schedule in December, even in a month where government usually takes a hiatus, we attended 2 planning commission meetings. By the way, they both went really well. One, the planning commission for the city of San Diego, and another, the planning commission for the much smaller city of Azusa. So and particularly in a state like California, and we do the southern half, but we're also in the state, so our capital matters to us as well. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. But that's nature of our job. So today, I'm a little bit of a forewarning. These slides are a little thicker than I'm used to. For those of you who listen to the monthly PGA chats, know I usually take 1 or 2 topics and take a bit of a deep dive and do it extemporaneously. There are myriad topics today because I wanted to give you sort of an overview of where things stand at various different levels in public policy, and that give you an idea. I'll let you draw some conclusions as to what to expect. John mentioned a State of the Union, and maybe I'll do this a little bit when wrapping up. As much as there are problems that beset the golf community in the state of California, I think everyone listening to this is aware of some of them, if not all of them. By and large, we punch way above our weight and do rather well for reasons I hope to explain, and reasons we should never lose sight of, because those are the things that are going to allow us to keep doing well. So I said there are a lot of slides, so it might behoove us, Kevin, to get off the first slide and move into the substance of today's little discussion. And before we do, I want to, something I just referred to, I want to review some at the state level, the legislative level, some of the key bills, not all of them, but certainly some that probably stand out. And I'm going to guess the top one there stands out to all PGA professionals, because the notion of the whole subject of independent contracting was really a sort of a PGA professional issue, although I always build it as an issue that it was necessary to deliver quality teaching, particularly in the public sector. Otherwise, it would wither. And Kevin and I are always responsible for translating everything into not just a concern of one niche of our industry, one profession, one job, one pesticide, one piece of regulation, but how it affects the communities or the actual constituents in which each legislator that they care about the most. They don't care so much about PGA professionals unless they play golf, in which case they often off to the side want a recommendation. But for the vast majority who don't, they want to know how it affects communities and the lives of their constituents. So I just wanted to go over that. And these, if you look at these are largely successes. I mean, it was a tough slog on independent contractors, but if you talk to some other sectors, particularly talk to the major newspapers in the state, and they didn't end up with what we ended up with, both in the form of AB 5 and in a much better form in the following year, AB 2257, which amounted to ways in which PGA golf professionals could continue to do independent contracting under a new set of arrangements and rules with their employers. Nonetheless, it's by and large worked out in about 97 or 98% of the cases. And I've always argued in the 2 or 3% where it doesn't work out, it's because the facility doesn't want to make it work out, not because the law doesn't enable it. At the same time, it also allows all those junior programs that we relish, whether it's PGA League, Junior League, or SCGA Junior Golf Foundation, or First Tees, or those kinds of things, to allow for youth sports coaches to operate as independent contractors. Otherwise, that whole model falls apart, and all that we have invested in Grow the Game programs would also fall apart. I don't think I need to go into the Public Golf Endangerment Acts, those two bills that would have provided hundreds of millions of dollars in free money to developers and cities to turn their municipal golf courses into affordable housing complexes. That got a lot of press, and I think was the greatest challenge in my time anyway that the golf industry faced, probably the greatest challenge it's ever faced in the history of California. And we came away, we won those battles, and we won them pretty convincingly. But in the process of doing it, those who thought those bills were good ideas learned a few lessons. We surprised them with some things. I fully anticipate whether they come back at us in 2024, as a string of newspapers editorialized in favor of during the summer of 2023, or whether it's a subsequent year. I think we always have to be on guard and always recognize you only surprise people once, and the people we surprise are much better funded, much better organized, and just a lot more powerful politically than we are. And I think they're still a little bit burned up that they lost that one as badly as they did. I mentioned AB 1346 because that also affects golf courses. And we were very successful at the legislative effort side of it, with the author getting him to put into what I referred to below as an efficacy standard. In other words, we have no problem buying electric equipment, but it has to work. Well, that hasn't translated so well with the California Air Resources Board, and that's one of the lessons you learn. Oftentimes, legislators are hale and hearty and willing to work with everyone because they every couple of years, 2 or 4 years, depending whether they're in the Assembly or the Senate, they have to stand before the voters, so they have to win that popularity contest. But the persons who get appointed to the administrative boards that are out of much less out of public view and don't have to receive public approbation all the time tend to be populated by true believers in that cause, and they're a little bit more rigid and often have the belief that they don't actually believe just because the equipment doesn't exist. They think if they mandate it in law that suddenly somehow engineering genius will allow it. So moving on, continuing with our dive into legislation, a little bit into the past. And yeah, Kevin, that was a clue to roll the slide. There we go. On the left is just a copy of the first page. This was actually a 2-page letter, which was a formal support bill of something that very significant. Some of the bills passed into law and more. There's a couple other slides of bills. And I led with AB 1572 because that's a prohibition of the use of potable water to irrigate non-functional turf. And now you may ask, why did we support that bill? Because we met with the author and we had some support from water agencies off to the side. We know that under California law, in fact, the bill author knew that under California law, golf is functional turf. It's part of the recreational community. But because we see so often from environmental groups and others who don't necessarily think golf should have such a predominant place in California as it does, they routinely refer to it, and it often gets repeated in media, as non-functional or ornamental, and it isn't legally. So we suggested that, to make that clear, that golf be specifically spelled out as exempt from this particular prohibition. Now, if you have a beautiful front lawn and you use potable water to irrigate it, in other words, out in the parking lot, that would be non-functional turf. And I just suggest that for any golf courses that don't have access to recycle and have such ornamental lawns. But the golf course proper itself is as sacred in this bill and is exempt as a sports field, a cemetery, just a plain old park, and so forth. And we considered that getting that into the bill had impacts. I mean, Kevin and I had the pleasure of actually interesting pleasure of a Santa Monica groundwater basin meeting. And let me just put it that of all the groundwater basins that we attend, that one is pretty strict on water. It's a tight one. They take their job very seriously. But seeing Mark Gold in the audience, who is really one of the great figures, I think, in California environmental history. He's really was kind of the driving force behind Heal the Bay. He's still, I believe, an adjunct professor at UCLA, and now he's the lead sort of water policy analyst for the Natural Resources Defense Council. And someone I've always admired, because we don't always agree on everything, but I've always found him to be scrupulously honest, intellectually honest, and fair. And he's always been tough on the golf industry, but sort of fair. And to hear him to encourage that body to adopt the very definition that's in this bill, 1572, so that there's an element of copying and pasting, so that specific call out of golf being exempt will be in all those little pieces of legislation, all those ordinances that are proliferating throughout California right now. That's how important that is. So those of you who do something very different for a living may find it interesting that you got people who are exultant to putting a couple of words in a bill, but just for those of you who pay really close attention, know the damage that's been caused for almost 50 years now, because while nobody was paying attention in 1977, slipped into the IRS code, golf was put in the chapter what we refer to as the sin list, and cannot receive any emergency federal relief money for hurricanes, earthquakes, or fires, because we're on a list of industries, I don't know, like liquor stores and whorehouses, that we're just not supposed to use. I know how we got categorized with that at the time, I don't know. Even I was too young to be involved in things in 1977, but that's been copied and pasted, and the golf industry at the national level has been unable to get it out for 50 years. That's why we consider this so important. I've listed other bills, Senate Bill 389, a very significant bill because it's one of the bills that passed initially that is really the beginning of upending water rights that date all the way back to the founding of the state, 1850, another key date, 1873, and a third date, 1913. And most of the water law hasn't really changed since then. That's 111 years now. And those things are just simply, it's not tenable anymore. And so this is sort of the first step. It was quite a battle. We're paying attention to the battle, not because we're part of it, but because it indicates to us that there's going to be a consistent movement to upend things that we may have come to rely upon. Right now, it affects agriculture and large cities for the most part, but anything that affects anything dealing with water ultimately works its way down to the golf industry. Another AB 363 in this last session, something that passed in another form in the previous session, and the governor vetoed it. The golf industry, we thought we were sort of, we didn't think we were wasting our time, but we didn't think it would have much impact. But we actually encouraged a gubernatorial veto in that year, because while agriculture was exempt to the extent to which they use licensed applicators for the neonicotinoids, we use licensed applicators too, but we're left out. The bill that passed in AB 36 in 2023 allows licensed applicators to apply it in a limited fashion. And while golf doesn't make major use of neonicotinoids, it is still important in some of the applications moving forward. So again, another two bills that we think were very successful from our point of view, and one bill that we're tracking very carefully because we think it portends a number of changes that are in the offing moving forward. And that's a clue. I've come to the end, Kevin, to kind of switch. And look at that, our capital. It's beautiful. So there are two bills that should be, we hope, we thought maybe yesterday would be docketed for hearings in committees next week or the following week because they're two-year bills. But there was a fracas at the Capitol yesterday and they didn't really get down to business. We'll see if they can get down to business today. Assembly Bill 460 is an assembly version and a somewhat stronger one of the bill I just talked about in Senate Bill 389, portending another beginning sort of undoing of old water rights that are just not tenable anymore. We will run out of water if we stick with this, which should be the great principle there is that our legal system, or if going all the way back to the English common law, changes over time to reflect changing attitudes and to reflect changing realities. It's not a fixed system. It's not the black letter law. I know that frustrates some persons who ask questions when a bill passes, what does that mean? And then you'll hear someone like me, or worse, a lawyer, say, well, we won't know until it goes through the appellate process. Well, how will, and they construe what the language means. And then someone will ask, well, how long will that take? Oh, I don't know, from 5 to 20 years. Which is not the definitive answer anyone is looking at for, and you get a little bit frustrated. But if you think of the opposite, something fixed in black letter law that was unchanging based on circumstance, and recognize that that's even a worse result. So these two bills are things that are going to come up as two-year bills. Two-year bill, simply we go on two-year sessions, and this is the second year of a two-year session. So those bills that either got pulled or made it through their policy at the end of the year can be extended by their author into a two-year process, but they have to get through their house of origin. In this case, both of these are in the assembly. They have to make it through committees, and then make it through appropriations, and then make it through a floor vote by January 31st. That's a pretty tight schedule. So most two-year bills fail. When hearkening back, just to give you an idea, AB 1910 was actually the third version of AB 672, which was a one-year bill and then a two-year bill. We had to fight it at the two-year level, and then it became another one-year bill. So 3 strikes, and we hope it's out permanently, but not necessarily. And these are just in the line of upending sort of those long-held rights, and we're paying close attention to that because anything involving water is ultimately going to affect the golf industry. Golf may not be a frivolous or a use of water, and it may not be, and turf used on a golf course is functional turf or recreational turf. Having said that, there are still priorities in California law, and the highest priority is human health, consumption, agriculture. Those are the high priorities. Parks, golf courses, sports fields are not that way. So as we wind our way through these legislative slides, there's always a bit of a delay. Look at that, the way they come in. I'm not going to go through all these bills. But these are some of the bills I'm highlighted that we followed, not because we lobbied them, because we just don't. When I said we punch above our weight, we don't punch so high as to get. And we're too smart to get involved in these. It's just taken together. Everyone out there needs to understand to the degree. Some of you may be exclusively teaching pros, but you're still attached to facilities, whether they're private clubs, whether they're public daily fee facilities or municipal facilities. They're also businesses. And just note, in California, labor is dominant in the capital, and I'm using a phrase at the top that Kevin and I used in a major public affairs update of last year, saying that basically everyone needs to heed labor's roar. They had a big year in the state legislature. They've had a number of big years. California is a labor state. Not everything that went through passed, and there are some pushbacks and so forth, but sometimes you can get a little wrapped up in the cocoons of particularly of private country clubs and the rest, and don't understand where the political power in the state is. And it's very much in labor. So that's why I include this. And these all passed into law. And although one of them that's on here, the SB 525, second from the bottom, since California employs a lot of healthcare workers directly for the state, and a lot of local governments do, the governor signed this bill, but now he's made a request that it be amended or substantial changes in 2024 on taking from where it is today within a few short years. So all healthcare workers would make a minimum of $25 per hour. It's interesting, when the state's actually the employer, they have a slightly different attitude. But let's roll the slide and keep moving through our deck here today. Other things we follow. We don't follow this because golf is directly, well, we follow this for two reasons. Everyone needs to understand that golf courses, and they're mostly in urban areas in the state. Why? Because that's where people live and people play golf, and and golf takes anywhere, whether it doesn't matter what the ownership of the facility is. It takes up to 200 acres of contiguous property that sits there. Only 90% of the population doesn't play golf. Doesn't matter which part of the electorate, doesn't matter whether you poll Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, people who live in downtown areas or live in the middle of nowhere. If you ask any Californian of any political stripe and any age group, what's the biggest problem we have? The answer is housing. It comes in number one in every poll. So as you drive by these big green spaces in the middle of town, and younger persons can't afford a house, and renters are being squeezed out, and the homeless population grows with each day, it's quite a fat target. That was the target of AB 1910, which is, in some respects, I have some knowledge of how we won that, and realized luck played a bit of a role. We were overmatched, and that was a tough one. And it's tough to go against the number one problem. But we pay close attention to anything which goes to the issue of local control, because people who live in communities tend to like the golf courses in their communities for a variety of reasons. But the state is increasingly recognizing the problem, is taking more and more control. I'm sure those of you who read newspapers know about it, and anyone listening to from Huntington Beach really knows about it. But that's not the only city in the state that's affected that way. So this is a bill that, a Senate bill in 2023 that passed. And the significance here is that this one was opposed by the building trades, which is among the 2 or 3 most powerful lobbies in Sacramento. The oil and gas industry may spend more money, but the building trades do phone banks and political action committees. And just to see them in action in Sacramento, they can stand in the back of the room and put their thumbs up or their thumbs down on something, and suddenly things go one way or the other. It's generally been common, it's been sort of a tradition of if the building trades oppose something, it's not going to pass the state assembly. Well, in this case, the building trades had a little bit of a trouble. They tried to derail this bill because it changed the standard in the housing legislation. It was extending, in labor's opinion, to be a little weaker from their point of view. But the housing issue is so strong that it went through this very pro-labor assembly. We went through, and we take note of that and mention it to you because it just indicates that those things which are impediments, we captured a lot of them in AB 19 in that particular fight. By the way, just as an aside, we never issued an economic argument when fighting AB 1910. We never talked about taxes. We never talked about jobs. We never talked about multiplier effects. And I want to emphasize to this audience, I emphasize it as much as possible. Why? Because if the issue is the economics of land use, golf will always lose. If the issues are environment, green space, recreation, quality of life, and to a small extent, the property values of the individual houses in the immediate neighborhood, those things are golf's favorable arguments. Whether they can continue to withstand a housing problem that just becomes more and more acute, and a legislature that's more and more and more inclined to simply take local control away and move it to the state remains to be seen. In some of the new appointments, we've taken great note that whereas when AB 1910 came up, Chris Holden from Pasadena was chair of appropriations, who's always been a very great supporter of golf. The new chair of appropriations under the new speaker, Rivas, is Buffy Wicks, who thought AB 1910 was a good idea. Appropriations is a powerful committee, and Buffy Wicks is a powerful housing advocate, and also an advocate of always what's referred to as infill, and seems to have a penchant for opposing any kind of development that goes into currently undeveloped areas, and always wants to build up in existing areas. Those are all things which, taken together, create an environment in which golf's going to have a tougher and tougher time in 2024 and beyond. That's why we track it. That's why I'm sharing it with you today. But I'm done sharing that one, which is, I guess, a clumsy clue to let's roll the slide. Still, some of these things fail. Labor may be powerful, but the idea at the end of the session to give unemployment benefits to striking workers, why that one collapsed. A bill which panicked us because it was floated, we didn't know where it came from, but it would have prohibited the use of all non-organics on golf courses and resorts in the California coastal zone. Well, that one collapsed. That one collapsed in committee in an almost embarrassing fashion. I enjoyed it, but certainly the proponents of the bill had to be embarrassed by it. So, and I also think, and Steve Bennett's AB 1563 didn't make it through again, but it's an effort that he has to get to give more power to groundwater sustainability agencies to be the actual giver of the entitlements for sinking of wells. Technically, it's counties. Steve Bennett was a county supervisor when he was in Ventura County, which has a pretty aggrieved groundwater basin, a lot of agriculture, and certainly some golf. He has tried to shift that power a little bit and has thus far failed. But we think he's going to come back, and we think ultimately he's going to fix it to get enough votes. So we're going to track that one. AB 1573 would have enshrined the same prescription of AB 1572 on potable water into the state's model water efficient landscape ordinance. It failed for technical reasons. We were perfectly good with the bill. In fact, we've worked for years and continue to work with the Department of Water Resources on protecting those things that are in the model water efficient landscape ordinance, which is the sort of default governing document for all planning agencies in the state of California, to enshrine the same principles we were able to protect in AB 1572. Indicates that golf courses are large landscapes for the purposes of budgets. Turf is turf, and no matter how much some environmental groups want to try, they cannot change the biological nature of the evapotranspiration factor of turf. But we've done some other things which I always referred to as sort of, I won't call them end runs, but sort of preemptive strikes to, in other words, find a way to regulate ourselves and come to a similar result, but to a result that is consistent with sound golf course business and sound golf course agronomy. That's kind of our job all the time. It isn't just about flailing our hands and objecting to things. That doesn't get you anywhere. Despite what you may watch our national legislature, you may think things work that way, and that may explain why our national legislature, otherwise known as Congress, isn't particularly functional. But that's not the way the world works. Even in a legislature like California, which is both houses of which are over 2/3 controlled by one party, there's still a sense within that party there are different interests. They don't agree on everything, and there's much more cooperation, collaboration, and particularly as you get down to the local levels, of people from different parties and different attitudes and so forth continue to work together to get things done, which is why at a certain level, some of the disease we all see at the national government does not exist in local and regional government, which is why at this point, they still continue to work, and may it ever be that way. And the citizens, let's make sure that we do our best to promote that kind of cooperation that actually gets things done for the greater population. We expect 1573 to be sort of fixed and come back in 2024. And we'll be just fine with it because it'll have the same language as 1572. And we're going to continue to watch 1563. We don't worry so much about, we work with, for example, groundwater sustainability agencies in the desert. And it's just a downright pleasure working with them. But there are a couple in the state that are sort of populated by ideologues who, and if truth be known, although they would never say it publicly, probably always have a couple of people who feel that golf probably doesn't belong in California because we use too much water, but if truth be known. But anyway, with that, I think on the right there, we have an assembly bill. What to expect in 2024? Well, I always say expect the unexpected. If the reason I went into such detail as to what's happened in 2023 and before is generally for almost everything in life, past is prologue. And in this case, expect more bills dealing with water, with trying to slowly but surely modernize California water law, take it out of the 19th century when we had a handful of people and a very, very different climate. I mean, one of the things we're discovering, apart from some of the incendiary stuff you read with people going into warring tribes on climate change, is that we based a lot of what we do, and we based a lot of our water infrastructure on a period of time coming out of a mini ice age in which the weather was, as we now know, geologists will tell us, was amazingly consistent and steady. Now we're in a more traditional unsteady period. And I'm always amused when we talk about the driest year on record, the wettest year on record. Our records are 150 years old. And in geological time, that's not even a nanosecond. So we're starting to come to terms with some of these things and realize that we have to be much more resilient in terms of how we plan things. Particularly, I used to say we were a state of 40 million, but now I guess we're 39 million. I'm not sure whether that's good or bad. That's the topic for another discussion in another day. But ultimately, that the growth is going to continue, and if it's going to continue, we're going to have to have an infrastructure for water and environment that accommodates that population. We expect to see many more bills taking local control away from local agencies and reposing it in the state legislature, and there can be a lot of fights on that. We're going to watch that because it impacts the labor bills. Each golf course has employees, is an employer in one way or another, and that's interesting. Federal, and technically I listed three things you may read about in some of the stuff that the national golf industry's put out. The waters of the United States is all upended. It's gone back and forth from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And now the Supreme Court has weighed in by requiring the Biden administration to sort of rework the old Obama rules. The reality in California is we have our own separate regulatory structure for that, and we don't care. The overtime thresholds, that's a major issue if you get ensnared in golf day. The federal government will never catch up to the state of California, which, by the way, as of a few days ago, goes to $67,000 per year. The H-2B visa is not relevant. I guess what I'm simply saying is that, and I had the occasion to say this in a conversation yesterday, that in 13 years in doing this job with the SCGA, and I did it for another organization prior, I have never contacted a member of our congressional delegation about anything involving golf because it's totally irrelevant to what affects every golf course every day. What affects your facility is local. It's a planning commission. It's a water commission. It's a water provider. It's a regional government. It's the state government. It's a regulatory agent of legislation, period. The only thing that I've ever done is support many of those cities and water districts that support our industry very well when they're seeking money from the federal government, whether it's in the Inflation Reduction Act, we've done a lot of that in the desert in the last year, or whether it was the city of Pico Rivera that needed some help when they had a 100-year flood of the San Gabriel River through their town, and a lot of their parkland, including their golf course, was destroyed. And we were able to support the legislation. In the question at the bottom, are we ready for what may come? I have no idea. I always worry. I wouldn't be honest with you. As well as I think we've been doing and as optimistic as I am, I would say that at almost every turn, and why I always say we punch well above our weight is because at every turn, those who seem to be when I say the other side, they're not our enemies. They're just interests and stakeholders and people with different opinions and different interests. And job one that Kevin and I have, or anyone trying to be an effective advocate has, is try to understand their position and most of all, respect it and try to know it from their point of view as well as they do. If nothing else, you won't be surprised by anything they say or do, and you'll begin to understand that they have good arguments too. Golf isn't always right about everything, and those things which serve our interests, sometimes we have some fairly weak points. Are we ready? I guess we'll find out. Maybe a year from now, we'll sort of know. Moving on from the legislative world to the regulatory world, which we're only going to cover a small piece of, and that deals with the Colorado Basin. Just as a little bit of a background, our water sources in Southern California, there's a lot more local water than most of us know. The Los Angeles County in particular has been graced by nature by a number of aquifers, some of which, like in the Northeast San Fernando Valley, are in need of recharge and are in the process of being recharged. San Diego County is not as lucky. They have limited groundwater access, and much of it is very brackish and not all that usable. So they're much more of an importer. But all of Southern California has one thing in common: the recognition that what we built our water importation system on, which was mostly the Sierra snowpack, those days have been changed by Mother Nature. Simply, even if you read the headlines at the beginning of the year, even though we're in an El Nino year and as much rain as we had in December, we're in a snow drought, because that is El Nino means warmer waters, which means the precipitation comes in the form of rain. But the way we've handled water in California is that enormous amount of snow that drops in the Sierra Nevadas, it melts slowly, which makes it amenable to capture through the rivers, and then we run it down the state and over the Tehachapi Mountains using quite a bit of energy. And that's the State Water Project, and that's a substantial portion of the water we import. Well, that source is we recognize that we had a great snow year last year. Who knows what's going to happen this particular winter? The next 10 to 14 weeks will tell us. But relying upon that would be a fool's errand. The other great source is the Colorado Basin in Southern California of imported water, and that is in serious trouble. Last year, the Rockies did better. Lake Mead and Lake Powell have risen well above. There's a certain level they drop below and they can't generate power anymore, and that's a level they just can't be allowed to get to, and anything and everything must be done to prevent that. In fact, both Arizona and California gave back a lot of water and stuck it in those lakes to make sure that it can continue to generate power in the Southwest and continue to be a source of imports for the Arizona State Water Project, which is key. So their temporary arrangements are in place. Let me backdrop. I'm confusing everyone a little bit. The original allocation formulas for the Colorado Basin were drafted in 1922, now 102 years ago. And at that time, there are 7 states. California is a disproportionate recipient of the water, because even in 1922, this was a significant and large and urban state with a lot of agriculture, particularly in the Imperial Valley, later a little bit in the Coachella Valley. Arizona had been in the Union 10 years. I think Phoenix and Tucson, were 2 gas stations and a general store. Las Vegas didn't exist. So, and Colorado's in this basin as well, and Denver was not the major metropolitan area it is today. And added on top of that, the government overestimated the amount of water that was produced even in 1922. It didn't make any difference for decades, because no one used their allocations except maybe the state of California, and that allowed for phenomenal growth. And then there have been a lot of changes over the years to accommodate growth in Arizona, some significant changes that I won't go into. But we've reached the point where a river is allocated at about 17 million acre feet is probably going to produce no more than 11 or 12 million, maybe 13 in a good year. In a bad year, it could even go below 10 million acre feet. Well, that's not going to work. So there've been a lot of voluntary, in fact, if you read the papers, you know, a lot of the 7 states and California included, California's desert included, have on a short-term basis agreed to give back some water so we can get between today and 2026, when right now all those states are furiously, and I say furiously and sometimes argumentatively, trying to work under the tutelage of the federal government to come to new agreements in 2026. No matter how you cut, and actually the voluntary agreements were made possible only because of last year's incredibly good precipitation year. Other than that, I think we'd still be fighting about that as Lakes Mead and Powell continue to go down. So we don't know the final result, but I can guarantee you it isn't a question of whether California's access to the river gets cut. It's just a question of how much. And so that means if you add the sort of declining reliability of the Sierra snowpack in combination with an allocation formula that's definitely going to be cut, it puts great pressure to continue to do the things that Southern California has been doing, whether it's San Diego and Orange County dealing in desalination, or Los Angeles County's voters voting by a 71% margin to tax ourselves. I live in LA County. On our property tax bills to create a massive stormwater capture, replenishment, cleaning, and system. We're moving, and what that means for the golf industry is, the good news is that's going to up the supply. The bad news is that so many of these costs are borne by ratepayers ultimately, and golf is an enormous ratepayer. I mean, you think about your housing, on your house, it's, if the bill doubles, you don't like it, but you can deal with it. But if you have a potable water budget of $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, and you're talking about that doubling in a course of years, that's something on an expense line which is pretty difficult to swallow. And I think golf has to recognize that it isn't just the access during droughts. And by the way, we did extremely well with that in 2022 at the crisis phase. And I would say that we did well only because we had spent the previous at least a decade, and sometimes some places 2 decades, developing really good honest working relationships with water providers. And we need to continue to do that. But even if the access and the allocations remain strong enough for the industry, the cost factor continues to affect us. And beyond that, and if we roll that slide, I think what I'm about to talk about is on that next slide. There, well, I've discussed some of it. Potable reuse. Again, those of you who read the headlines know that right now, the state of California, the State Water Resources Control Board, is rewriting Title 22. That's the water title. To accommodate the use of effluent to create drinking water. So what that means is, to the golf community, which is relied upon and will continue in some places where it's available, to substitute recycled water for potable water as a longer-term solution. We're now going to be competing with creating that as drinking water. And there's only so much effluent to go around. So that's going to be another, in addition to the cost, that's another factor to consider. So I've said this to a lot of particularly private clubs in recent years. If you're renegotiating a long-term access agreement with a provider for recycled water, do not argue about the cost. Just simply try to get as long a term as possible so you can guarantee, and then begin preparing yourself over time, because you have time. That allocation is going to be cut probably. And there are a lot of and again, private clubs have an advantage because they have the budgets, and often they have the perspicacity to look at these things longer term. I worry a little bit more about those that are struggling, and of course always in the municipal sector, because their budgets are less, and it's just a different business model. 2 other things, the one water, I've referred to this. Southern California is going to be weaned off imported supply in favor of local supplies. That's going on. But if you look at that impact, and I think I've said this and I'll say it again, all this costs real money. Ratepayers remit much of that. and golf is a huge ratepayer. Just do the math, connect the dots, and anticipate. So there is something, when you look at the ROI, whether you're looking at replacing lake liners, whether you're looking at taking out turf, keep in mind that there's more that goes into an ROI than the next couple of years. Ultimately, the long-term health, and I'm aware there are certain clubs out there now doing 11, 12, $13 million projects that, and the ROI is not really in the bottom line. The ROI is that they want to be a club 20 and 30 years from now, and they recognize they need to do these kinds of things. And another thing, governor's initiative, we're moving into an area where we're sort of redoing the Golf 2020 framework for urban retail water suppliers. And it's you can count on the fact that it's going to reduce, it's going to take those budgets that we easily accommodate now and change that paradigm and simply make them stricter. So everything is militating in favor of getting out in front of reducing water supply. I just leave it at that. And we can move on because I promised to get through all this. And so I don't want to give short shrift to this particular slide, because all the things I've talked about are details. But I can tell you this, Kevin can tell you this, and there aren't many persons who can tell you this, because not many persons are actually employed every day trying to sit in the rooms where golf is regulated, where policy is made, to sit with lawmakers, to sit with their staffs. And by the way, lawmakers, staffers tend to be really bright young people. So if you go into a meeting, don't think you're going to BS these people. If you don't know your stuff, be honest about it. You can always play the role of simply, I'm a constituent, I'm not an expert. Don't try to be one if you're not. I assure you it won't work. But what we recognize is the result we get is based more upon what that person sitting across from us thinks of us. And I put in big red letters, and it's going to make a lot of you mad, and that's the point here, because this is what too many think of golf when you walk into a room. And they define it as too much land that uses too much water to serve the interests of the too few who have had too much for too long. That's a caricature. It's not accurate. If it makes you mad, good. Don't get mad. Take it seriously, and understand that every communication, every position that we do or we take on a bill, everything the game does in the public arena, and that includes golf professionals, no matter how obscure, has to be calculated to never give any credence or any evidence that can be construed as giving credence to this caricature, and always provide the evidence that can persuade all who hold it to reconsider that view. That is the overarching challenge. Golf's fate, golf's great sin is we love to talk to each other, and we all agree golf is good. We're the converted. And those persons at your club, or those persons who frequent your daily fee facility, or come to your, or try to make tee times at your municipal golf facility, they're the converted. They don't need to be persuaded that golf is good. They play the game. It's the 90% who live in the communities. Our goal as an industry has to be at all times, so that no matter whether if you've never played golf and you never have any intention, you think it's a stupid game, people hitting a white ball walking around a field, when they drive by it in their neighborhood, whether that golf course is a private club, a daily fee facility, or a public parkland golf facility, otherwise known as municipal, we want them to think this is good for me. It's a good green space. It's good for the environment. It's good for the community. It's a place, even though I don't play golf, I can book the banquet room and hold a meeting. It's good for charitable, the amount of charity that's raised there in tournaments and so forth. You want that to be seen as a community asset, because at the end of the day, that is the difference maker on how people will deal with us. That's the bottom line in whether the regulators are fair to us, or are kind to us, or unkind to us, and whether legislators have sympathy, so that when you sit down with someone on a 1572 or a 1573 and say, yeah, I know, we know, and technically under California law, golf's part of that recreational community, but would it hurt to say, recreational turf is exempt, including but not limited to, and it lists a few things, and golf courses are prominent. And if what they think of golf is that red letter statement, they're not going to give it to. They're not going to. They're going to think, well, maybe in the future, maybe it shouldn't be. But if they have a benign view of golf or a positive view of the game and what it brings to greater communities and to those who never play golf, then they're going to be, I don't want to say good to us, they're going to be fair to us. That's all we ever ask, is to be treated equitably and fairly, not necessarily to be given any kind of preferential treatment.
So Craig, a real
Yeah.
quick question here. You had said early on in the presentation that AB 1910, that we as a golf community were winning that battle against that bill. But then you talked about in July of this last year that there was a resurgence in the bill and that it's not going away. Where is
Wasn't,
the? Oh, go ahead.
let me be specific. The Southern California News Group, which is 11 newspapers, the lead papers are the LA Daily News, the Long Beach Press Telegram, the Riverside Press Enterprise, Pasadena Star News, South Bay Daily Breeze. In other words, it covers a wide swath. It may have greater circulation than the LA Times, or certainly rivals it, and it's pretty comprehensive geographically. On July 5th, they editorialized as a board and said that we should bring this bill back in 2024. And they what struck me in that editorial was not all the inaccuracies. I paid attention to that as well. But it was the notion, that the line that we know a lot of people play and enjoy golf, but exactly when did golf become an organized, powerful lobby? And I think that was their way of telling the supporters of the bill that don't be afraid about bringing this back. This is not the building trades or the trial lawyers or the teachers union or any of those people that you need to be afraid of in the Capitol. And they're right about that. They're not. And if they editorialize, we have to wonder, is it just the meanderings of it's a libertarian editorial board. It's not conservative, it's not left, it's libertarian. That's what defines them, and that's how they define themselves. So at the end of the day, I've been tangling with them for 30 years. They don't believe in municipal golf. They think that anything that can be done in the private sector should only be done in the private sector. Of course, if you're a golf professional, our industry, absent the public sector, would probably be 40% smaller than it is today. Consider that. And so they just, so our curiosity is whether or not something is up. We know that the amount of groups that pushed 1910 included some powerful, the lead was something called Yes in My Backyard, YIMBY, but it is very well funded by the real estate industry, by tech billionaires and various others. And of course, it's always great to go behind. And we knew there was a lot of development money, a lot of powerful interests that pushed 1910. Whether or not we dissuaded them that this was, whether or not maybe we got everyone to agree with the Los Angeles Times, which had a very different take on 1910, they thought housing was a big enough problem that every idea merited a conversation, and this one merited a conversation. But then they proceeded to call it a stupid idea, and they listed 8 things we should look at before we looked at public golf courses as solutions to the housing problem. And then, of course, they repeated all the facts about golf that we've been putting into the stream, that municipal golf courses are not elite institutions, and the average greens fee is $38, and all those kinds of things that we desperately try to share with the world. And the LA Times shared it in a Sunday editorial, and we hope that's the prevailing. But seeing that thing just gave me an indication. Did somebody put them up to it? Do they know something we don't know? What's going on? So nothing's been filed, but we kind of discovered in researching on 1910 that the energy for it goes all the way back to 2017, and it didn't get filed initially until 2021. So that's often, as I often say, in golf seems to think that what you do is you look at a bill, and when it gets filed, you take some kind of action, otherwise known as being totally reactive. And I'm always preaching, I'm not sure anyone believes me, but always preaching that by the time something gets into print, and particularly if it has a lot of backers and has a little bit of traction, it's been worked on for 5, 6, 7 years. which is probably why I spent a lot of time in this presentation on bills some may have thought were extraneous. Why are we talking about housing and some of these other things that don't directly affect the golf industry? Because they do affect the golf industry, because it's sort of the zeitgeist, the thinking, the background that leads in certain inevitable directions, some of which can be dangerous to golf, and some of which can be very, very positive golf. For example, I referenced Measure W in the county of Los Angeles, and some question, why would we be warm towards a parcel tax? Well, because it provides an enormous supply of groundwater for a sector that without water we go away. No water equals no golf. I mean, the end of story in a state like in a place like Southern California. I hope I answered your question.
Yes. And also, can you talk a little bit back? Can we come back to AB 5? Many golf professionals have been able to maintain their independent contractor status by becoming an LLC and paying rent to that facility in order to teach and run that business. Can you talk a little bit about the future of that practice and where AB 5 stands at the present time?
I'm going to call it AB 2257 because that was the successor bill, which took AB 5 and made it better. And it made it better from this point of view as well. So there is a 11-pronged test. If you pass all the prongs, if you can fit within them, you can operate as an independent contractor. 10 of them pose no problem for a traditional golf operation. You can change up, as you suggested, that's one way, not the only way to fit it in. The 11th prong is only a problem because it's the second on the list, I believe, because no one knows what it means. If you ask me what it means, so anything which is undecipherable, you have to add as a problem, but it hasn't proven to be an impediment. I call that successful because we did work directly with the author, who is now the head of the Labor Federation in California. So we're working I just want to point out, we can work effectively with those who many listening may think somehow are implacable foes of the golf industry. And when I was able to explain exactly what we were getting at, and I brought in, and I'll give him a shout out, one of the great members of your section, O.J. Amaya from Chula Vista, and he was magnificent, showing how the importance of, I'm a talking head, got all the policy, but when he came in and explained to Lorena Gonzalez how this would affect teaching and public golf and his business and his livelihood, that got her attention. And so we did very well with it. Sorry to get slightly off the subject, but I think that's solidified. The only thing that we would potentially work on, if we're not, fending off other disasters, is taking that one prong that we find confusing and maybe trying to get someone to rewrite it so that we can at least know what it means. And we're probably not the only one suffering that problem right now. So that one's by and large, we succeeded with that. And I think we should take great pride into it, having done it. Anyway, so there is a last slide here, and it really goes to the previous slide. And by the way, as of last night, I think I can add another golf course to this Buenaventura for other reasons. This is just a list of the places that Kevin and I are working on. Most of them are extremely successful. If I can find. Okay, I'm unmuted now. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. I don't know how I got muted. So these are not all. They're either, some few of them are daily fee golf courses, but these are in essence were movements usually based on false information. There are a lot of folks out there that covet golf's land. They see it, they want it for their own purposes, and the purposes vary. It's not just housing. It can be in the Sepulveda Basin, it was for open space. And so forth. In some places, it's for development. By and large, in every one of these examples here, we have that I've listed. I left the one that we flopped on. We're in the process of succeeding, proving that if golf can organize, array its arguments, and develop and get people from local communities off their backsides and out to defend and to speak up for these golf courses, we can win all these battles. And in some cases, as I look down here, Montebello, it's not, did we win it in the sense of all 18 holes remain? No, but 9 holes plus a short course and a development center in a place, Montebello is not a hotbed of golf. And it may be in some people's minds a hotbed of the kind of politics that they may think is inimical golf, but that's far from the truth. And golf needs to get out of its little silos and recognize there's enormous support for the game in all kinds of places in California and among all kinds of demographics and constituencies. So in all these cases I'm looking at, they're in various different stages, but I would regard them as successes, and some of them are maybe successes in progress. So the problem, though, is that we're defending. Given the costs of land and construction, I would say in urban California, I'd be surprised if another golf course ever gets built. So keep that in mind. As much as we're so thrilled that we're thrilled because you can't get a tee time in a municipal system, and clubs that were sort of giving away memberships now have waiting lists and charging quite a bit more, and that's all great for the industry. But these little developmental facilities, all the growth programs we've invested in, these are the places where we start the game's growth cycle. If they don't exist, we have nowhere to grow it. And even at the more mature level, if people don't have places to play, whether it's as private member or just a public golfer, ultimately we've topped out. We cannot continue to grow this. Now, if you own a golf course, maybe you think, well, it's not so bad because I lose some competition. But I think I'm talking to PGA professionals, whether I'm talking to superintendents, if I'm talking to Callaway or Titleist that makes equipment. If you earn your livelihood at this game, it's not in your interest to not grow. It's certainly not in your interest to shrink, and it's in your interest to try to get some growth. So I need to point these things out. We need to pay attention to what I call these mega challenges. And I don't blame anyone listening for not. You have tough jobs. I know, John, I know your schedule over at South Hills. That you got a handful going on, but it's up to the leadership organizations, whether it's the USGA, the PGA of America, whether on the local level, SCPGA and SCGA. I happen to think SCPGA and SCGA are exemplary in the way they do this, but not all of our colleagues around the country. They need to look at the broad picture that I'm trying to talk about here today and do that. And at the national level, we haven't always done our best in that regard. I'll just leave it at that. And that's probably the most benign. And privately, I can be pretty critical with these leadership organizations because the job of leadership organizations is to lead. It's not necessarily the job of a golf course superintendent or a PGA pro or a GM or a sales rep for a major manufacturer. Their job is to do their job and hope that the organizations of which they're a part can do that greater job of looking beyond next month, next quarter, next year, and shorter term. And I would encourage all of you, we need to do that with our own organizations. And some do it better than others. And I'm part of as exemplary as I think the Southern California Golf Association is. I think if my friends know at the USGA, I've been pretty critical of their lack of leadership on some of these things and will continue to be critical because my love of the game isn't the love of the institutions. It's the love of the game. And it's ironically, the game's been around 600 years. It'll be around another 600 years. It'll have ups, it'll have downs, it'll have fads, it'll have all kinds of things going on. But ultimately, the human beings will always be attracted to to the great things that the game offers. So never forget that, and let's focus on that. And that may be a good point on which to end this thing as a sort of a shout out to the greatness of the game of golf. I don't know. Now, I'm sure I've raised some questions that I haven't answered, but I'll throw it back to you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Craig. I don't have any other questions beyond the ones I asked, but on behalf of the Education Committee for the Southern California PGA, thank you very much for coming on this morning. A lot to digest. Anything that comes up for the audience after the fact, we will be sending out the YouTube recording of Craig's presentation, has his contact information listed on it below. Craig will also be in the email that I send out with the YouTube recording. On behalf of the section, thank you very much to all the PGA members for supporting the Catalyst this morning. Craig, Kevin, thank you very much for your time. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining the Catalyst webinar.
Thank you, John.